In September 1940, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill woke up to terrible news. 100,000 Nazi soldiers had defeated his forces in brutal combat and managed to cross the English Channel, separating the United Kingdom from France. At that very moment, they were on English soil. The few planes that were still usable could do nothing against them, and the Allied army was quickly becoming overwhelmed. Even though the politician had thought it impossible, the Germans had reached his nation, bringing with them their destructive war machine. This, clearly, never happened. The British Air Force was able to contain the German attacks, and Hitler was forced to definitively postpone his invasion. But what would have happened if Nazism reached the gates of Buckingham Palace? How would the war have continued with the United Kingdom off the map? If you want to know the answer, stay with us, because today, in this new military history video, we will tell you what would have happened if the Nazis won the Battle of Britain and if Hitler continued to extend his rule of horror. Before we dive into this alternative scenario, we must discuss what the world situation was like before the start of the Battle of Britain. By July 1940, much of Western Europe was in the hands of Adolf Hitler's Germany. Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands had fallen, and even the mighty France could not resist the modern German forces. The United Kingdom was completely alone, becoming the only obstacle to the total domination of the continent by the Nazis. The Führer and his generals wanted to continue their winning streak. By that date, the British had lost approximately 70,000 men, killed, wounded, and captured, as well as tons of equipment, ammunition, and vehicles. The Germans knew that if they managed to take the offensive towards England, they would have the advantage. The Nazi High Command began planning the details of Operation Sea Lion, the naval invasion of the United Kingdom. On July 16th, Hitler declared, "As England, despite its desperate military situation, still shows no signs of willingness to come to terms, I have decided to prepare this operation, which has as its objective the elimination of the English homeland as a base from which the war against Germany can be continued, and, if necessary, the complete occupation of the country." Both Hitler and his advisors, however, knew that before any invasion, they had to eliminate a major obstacle in their path, the Royal Air Force. If they did not do so, the ships tasked with transporting troops across the English Channel would be bombed and destroyed by British aircraft. The attack would be stopped before it even began. To prevent this situation, the Führer ordered the mission to Hermann Göring, leader of the German Air Force, or Luftwaffe. His objective was the complete destruction of English coastal airfields and the factories where their planes were built. Göring expressed doubts about the possibility of carrying out his directives, but the Führer turned a deaf ear to his complaints. So confident was he that he had already named the person who would be the commander-in-chief of the conquered country. This was Walter von Brauchitsch, who had already fulfilled similar roles in Poland and France. The Battle of Britain began on July 10th, 1940. The heights were the scene of this brutal air combat, which lasted for more than 3 months. The German offensive was total, with daily attacks against the southern coast of the country. The British pilots had almost no rest from the constant raids of their enemies, but despite exhaustion and a large number of casualties, they were able to repel most of the German bombers. In September 1940, frustrated by the lack of results, Hitler decided to change his objective. Instead of destroying military installations, he would seek to terrorize English citizens by bombing their cities, including London. He thought that if he could destroy the morale of the civilian population, they would urge the then Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his cabinet to negotiate with the Germans.
Nobody denies that the raiders have done some damage, but though one house hit in the street makes a nasty mess, it isn't going to win the war for Germany. And if we still look to our blackout, it'll be still more difficult to hit houses. Now, just a few more wrecks of Nazi planes to show that we're keeping up the average. In the first year of this war, British pilots have brought down 1,752 in raids on this country.
But despite the tens of thousands of deaths caused by the Nazi air raids, the British will held out. Moreover, the change in strategy allowed the Royal Air Force to recover and once again confront the Luftwaffe raids. Ultimately, due to the high number of German casualties, Hitler decided to postpone the invasion indefinitely. The Battle of Britain had ended on October 31, 1940, with an Allied victory. But what would have happened if the Führer had not given up? How would history have turned out if the Royal Air Force had been destroyed? We invite you to explore this intriguing possibility below. Let's go back to September 1940. Hitler, instead of changing his strategy and moving on to civilian targets, orders a redoubled effort against English airfields. Against all odds, the Germans managed to suppress the Royal Air Force until they achieved complete superiority in the air. With no obstacles in the way, the green light is given to invade the United Kingdom. Nearly 100,000 soldiers crossed the English Channel to trample British soil under their boots. The local army tries to resist, but is quickly swept away by the German Blitzkrieg, which combines infantry maneuvers with tanks and aircraft. Without an air force capable of supporting them, they can do nothing against the attacks of enemy aircraft on their positions. Despite the desperate attempts of the defenders, the capital, located near the southern coast of the country, quickly falls. Everyone in the government knew the symbolic and moral blow that would mean if Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, fell into the clutches of the Nazis. The Führer would not resist displaying her as a trophy, so Churchill and the royal family are forced to go into exile in Canada, a colony of the British Empire. The war continues for a few weeks, but by November, the last sectors of resistance are eliminated. With the final surrender of the English army, the Allied faction officially ceases to exist. Adolf Hitler is the leader of Europe. But this does not mean that the entire population accepts the conquerors. This is where Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch comes into play. As we already mentioned, he is the piece Hitler has in mind to fill the role of Commander-in-Chief of the United Kingdom, and he had already fulfilled similar roles in other conquered countries. During the occupation of Poland, the Nazi officer had allowed his soldiers to commit any kind of crime against civilians, no matter how brutal. Robberies, rapes, torture, and murder were extremely frequent, and they continued to occur in the ghettos and concentration camps where the Poles were held. Their population, mostly Jewish and Slavic, was considered inferior to the Aryan Germans, and for this reason they were not shown the slightest mercy. But that was not the case in France. There, the Nazi soldiers generally behaved with respect and politeness. They paid for items in shops rather than stealing, and were severely disciplined if they did not. Of course, they were cruel and brutal towards people they labeled as undesirable, but not towards those of the so-called European race. In England, von Brauchitzsch's planned strategy would have followed the same steps, although it never came to fruition. But in our alternative version of history, we can see it in action.
A firm and cautious attitude towards the civilian population is to be adopted. The death sentence may be imposed for acts of violence against orderly members of the population or for looting. Any private purchases by individual soldiers are to be paid for in cash. The rate of exchange will be 1 English pound for 9.6 Reichsmark.
Even with much of England in ruins, purchases by German soldiers are making some vendors a huge profit. Some people even wonder if the German occupation would really be that bad. But this hides the Nazis' true, much darker intentions. The German leadership's plan is only just beginning. Von Brauchitsch orders that English prisoners of war, held in concentration camps within the country, be taken to France. The occupation of the territory is still very fragile. Relocating the soldiers allows the Nazis to hold a card to control the population. The well-being of these prisoners depends on the good behavior of the British citizens. If they rebel against their conquerors, they will be the ones to pay the consequences. If this first option does not work, the Nazis have another way of securing the cooperation of civilians. This is Dr. Franz Six, who had been put in charge of England's internal security when Operation Sea Lion was being planned. He was part of the SS, the most important paramilitary organization in the Third Reich, and the most brutal. Its members were used as guards in concentration camps, where they gave free rein to their most inhuman side. They were also used in the massacres of Jews and Slavs in Poland, where thousands of people were shot or burned alive. In our alternate history, SIX's mission in the UK is simple: to eliminate anyone suspected of harboring anti-German sentiments.
Dr. Franz Six was typical of the sort of people that ran these task forces, in the sense that he was a sort of ex-hack journalist who'd somehow or other, because of his politics, managed to become a professor at a good university, believing that wasn't enough for him. So he's a sort of typical demi-educated graduate, and these people were utterly ruthless and without scruple. And had he, judging by what his colleagues did in other countries, I mean, the slightest provocation, he would have been let loose on parts of the British population and would have done God knows what.
Assisted by a death squad, just a few days after arriving in the country, Dr. Franz Six begins his operation. In his possession is the so-called Black Book, written during the preparations for Operation Sea Lion. Inside is a list of nearly 3,000 names, each one indicating a woman or man who was to be arrested. It includes members of the government, writers, intellectuals, journalists, and exiles from other European countries. Among them are figures such as Winston Churchill, H.G. Wells, author of The War of the Worlds, and even Sigmund Freud, although he had died the previous year. Throughout the remainder of 1940, these people are arrested and imprisoned. Some manage to escape, but the rest are deported to concentration camps in Germany or in captured territories. There, they will be subjected to torture, and many of them will end up being killed. Churchill and the royal family follow every move from Canada, but they can do nothing to stop their enemies. The only thing left for Adolf Hitler was to install a pro-Nazi government, as had been done in France. That country had been divided in two, with one part of the territory occupied by German forces and the other by a puppet state, Vichy France. The United Kingdom now faces a similar fate. London and the southern part of the nation would be under direct command of the Reich, but in the north, power would be taken by Edward Wood, also known as Lord Halifax, who until the time of the invasion was the British foreign minister. Before the start of the Second World War, he had shown an appeasing policy with Hitler, seeking to reconcile himself with his regime rather than limit it. The Nazis were in favor of using established figures in conquered countries and not introducing new ones, so this man would be very useful for their intentions.
We know from the 1930s and from the era of appeasement that there were politicians who wanted to deal with the Nazis on the basis that they were reasonable political people.
This morning I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler.
We should ask nothing better, as we have said more than once, than to work with Germany.
With the nation now completely in their hands, and the most important figures of any possible resistance neutralized, the Nazis have a clear path to consolidate their victory. While the treatment of the English population was correct up to the moment, this only happens with those considered to be of Aryan race. In the United Kingdom, there were a large number of Jewish refugees who fled from Germany or other regions of continental Europe, escaping the German advance. Many of them, under suspicion that they could be enemy spies or saboteurs, had been imprisoned by the English themselves months before the invasion. The Jewish refugees on British soil then become easy prey for the Germans. The fate of the locals belonging to this population is not very different. The possibilities of escaping the island are extremely difficult due to the German naval blockade. The story follows what happened in the other conquered countries. Shop owners see their businesses expropriated, workers are fired, and young people are denied the possibility of studying at universities. By early 1941, the vast majority of Jews are placed in ghettos or concentration camps within the country. The living conditions for these people, as in the other captured territories, are terrible, with water, food, and shelter denied to them. Thousands die long before the systematic slaughter of the final solution begins. Although the war seems over, Hitler has not yet given up his ambitions. His next target is the Soviet Union. In the true story, the invasion of this country had been planned for mid-May 1941, But the Führer was forced to divert men and resources to the conflict in Greece to ensure victory for his Italian allies, countered by the war support provided by the English. In our alternative version, no help provided by the British reaches the Greek peninsula, so the massive operation against the Soviets is carried out in a timely manner.
So in other words, he would have been able to launch Operation Barbarossa on schedule earlier than the 22nd of June 1941. That in turn would have meant that they could have swept towards Moscow and Leningrad without the encumbrances of the onset of autumnal rains and let alone the winter. And given that the Soviet Union just literally fell apart, they would have conquered it.
With the fall of the Soviet Union, Hitler has only one obstacle standing between him and global domination: the United States. The Americans, while never hiding their sympathy for the Allies, had until now remained officially neutral. But with the fall of England, they might have been forced to enter the conflict even before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. However, even if this had been the case, their situation would be extremely precarious. They had no strategic assets from which to plan a landing on Nazi territory. It is very likely that any kind of invasion would be violently repulsed, with many American casualties. Hitler is aware that he has the advantage, but despite some of his generals urging him to continue the war, he is in favor of waiting for his rival's next move. Even so, he orders the construction of weapons capable of destroying American forces should hostilities begin. The design of bombers capable of crossing the Atlantic Ocean and gigantic warships began, but more importantly, progress was made with the creation of nuclear bombs. By conquering the United Kingdom, the Germans combined their atomic knowledge with that of the English, and were much closer to achieving the first weapon of mass destruction. The Americans also had advances in this field, and both countries managed to design the explosive within a very short time of each other. Both Hitler and the then American President Franklin Roosevelt knew that if these bombs were used, both countries would be completely pulverized. With the threat of mutual destruction, the two nations became involved in a Cold War. Winston Churchill and the royal family, who never recognized the puppet government of Lord Halifax, were the first to ally themselves with Uncle Sam from Canada, but they were not the only ones. In the following years, the two New World powers would try to consolidate their ideologies through clandestine support for other countries, just as happened between the United States and the Soviet Union in real history. We've reached the end of the video and we want to ask you, what do you think would have happened if the Nazis had won the Battle of Britain? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.